They found the first girl at dawn on the lip of the cane field, her calico dress unbuttoned down the spine as though someone had been counting the knobs of bone that ride beneath the skin like rosary beads, and every button had been a prayer whispered backward. Her bare feet were clean, almost polished, the soles pale as candle tallow despite the red clay that stretched for miles in every direction. And between her toes lay a single thread of Spanish moss so fresh it still bled sap, the same luminous green that stains baptismal water when a body is held under too long. There was no mark on her, no blood, no bruise, only the wide black of her eyes reflecting a sky the color of spoiled milk, and when the overseer rolled her over with the toe of his boot the pupils did not shrink though the sun had climbed above the levee and the light struck her like a verdict. Instead the eyes kept drinking it in, 2 holes poked through the world's bright muslin so that whatever looked out of her could see all the way back to the barracoon at Ouda, to the mouths of other girls who had vanished in the holds of ships that smelled of piss and pine tar, to the night soil of Baton Rouge where the bones of the first colony lie still whispering the French they died speaking. The other women were made to stand in a half-circle while the doctor, if the man who bled horses and set the broken legs of sugar kettles could be called that, pressed his ear to her chest and announced, in the tone he reserved for diseased livestock, that the heart beat yet, though faintly, like a moth batting inside a jar, but when they carried her to the quarter no breath fogged the tin mirror held to her lips, and by the time the sun reached its zenith the body had begun to cool from the outside in, the skin stiffening into the texture of parchment on which someone has written a single sentence and then thought better of it, rubbing the ink away until only a bruise-colored ghost of letters remains. Old Lila, who had once been midwife to half the parish and who knew the taste of every root that could either coax a womb open or seal it forever, said the girl's mouth tasted of honey and rust, the flavor that comes when a man spends himself on a woman and then kisses her as if to steal back the gift. She said also that beneath the honey lay something sharper, the green bite of copper that lingers on the tongue after a candle snuffer has been sucked for luck, and she spat 3 times into the dust and would not speak again for a week. That night the quarter was quieter than it had ever been, not even the hush of bare feet on packed earth or the small cluck of hens settling under the floorboards. The silence felt oiled, deliberate, the kind that creeps into a room when a master stands outside the door listening for the exact moment a thought turns traitor. Somewhere up the river a steamboat blew its whistle, 3 long notes that usually meant passengers for the city, but tonight the sound flattened against the dark like a bird striking glass, and every woman lying on her plank cot felt the same picture bloom behind her eyes, a man she had never seen, tall, narrow through the hips, skin the color of fresh maize, hair wet as though he had just stepped out of the river, smiling with all his teeth at once. They did not speak his name, because they did not know it yet, but the shape of him settled into the marrow of their dreams, and when they woke the sheets beneath them were damp with dew or something sweeter, something that dried yellow and stiff as eggcloth and smelled faintly of the blossoms that open only at night along the Mississippi's throat. The year was 1845, the month May, when the cane had grown high enough to hide a man on horseback if he sat sideways, and the air clung to the skin like a shirt soaked in cane juice and dried without rinsing. At Bellevue Plantation the big house stood 3 stories of white-painted brick, its galleries wide enough that a child could run their full length without ever touching sunlight, supported by columns fluted in the Roman fashion which the present master's father had ordered copied from a picture book brought upriver on the same flatboat that carried the first corful of slaves. Bellevue had been carved out of a Spanish land grant in the days when the territory still belonged to crowns instead of banks, and the family that owned it, first the de Laurels, then the Wickers by marriage, had never sold an acre, only added, so that now the place stretched across both banks of a lazy bayou named for a Choctaw word no white tongue could pronounce correctly, a word said to mean either "I surrender" or "I curse you," depending on how sharply the final syllable is bitten off. The house faced east, toward the river road along which the cane was hauled in wagons whose iron rims rang like dull bells, and every morning the sun struck the fanlight above the front door so that the colored glass threw broken rubies across the parquet floor. By afternoon the same sun had traveled above the chimney stacks, and the heat pooled in the upper rooms until the wallpaper, imported from France and patterned with tiny gold fleur-de-lis, began to sweat glue, the seams sighing open. like the mouths of women who have decided never again to speak of what they know. In the library, kept locked except on Sundays when the family returned from St. Joseph's Church, there stood a walnut cabinet containing ledgers that stretched back to 1798, each volume bound in calfskin dark as tobacco juice, the pages ruled in red ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. Inside these books every purchase and sale of human life was noted in a hand so precise it might have been engraved, and beside each name a small cross had been added in the margin when that life ended, the strokes so faint they could be mistaken for a slip of the quill unless one knew to look for them. The present master, Thaddeus Wicker, had inherited Bellevue at 32, a man already old in the eyes, with hair the color of storm-weathered cypress and a mouth that smiled only on its left side, as though the right corner had been stitched down by some secret disappointment. He wore coats of black broadcloth even in summer, and the slave said that when he walked the fields at twilight the cane leaves turned their pale undersides toward him as if the plants themselves feared to meet his gaze. His wife, Eliza, was 10 years younger, a small woman with skin so fine the veins showed blue at her temples, and a habit of pressing her thumb against her lower lip when she thought no one watched, a gesture that left a white crescent mark which did not fade for an hour. She had come from Charleston with a dowry of 47 souls and a pianoforte said to have belonged to a signer of the Declaration, though the instrument had not been played since the winter her first child died of croup, and the tuner, a free man of color, had been sold south for daring to remark that the Middle Sea had begun to sound like a woman coughing blood. Beneath the big house, reached by a staircase so narrow a man must turn sideways, lay the brick-lined cellar where the previous master had stored claret and prints of naked women sketched in Naples, but Thaddeus had ordered the bottles removed and the walls whitewashed, and now the place echoed like a throat. Sometimes, when the wind came off the river at a certain angle, the housemaids claimed they heard singing rising from below, a man's voice too sweet for any throat they knew, winding through the floorboards until it found the thin slats of their own beds and pressed against their spines like a hand that has learned exactly where the heart beats hardest. They said the trouble began with a purchase made in Baton Rouge on a day when the sky hung low and yellow as a sick dog's eye, the kind of weather that makes men reckless because it feels like evening all morning and they forget the difference between what they want and what they can buy. Thaddeus had ridden in with 2 wagons to fetch a new lot, 23 men and women shipped down from Virginia after the failure of an estate that had tried to grow wheat on land better suited to sorrow, and among them stood a boy who looked too old to be called a boy and too young to be called a man, though his shoulders had already widened into the shape that promises strength and his hands, chained together at the wrist, hung with the stillness of someone who has learned that any movement can be interpreted as escape. The auctioneer, a red-cheeked man whose voice cracked on the vowels like a schoolboy's, announced the youth as a prime breeding stock, guaranteed sound, with papers from the Tidewater, but when Thaddeus asked his age the boy lifted his face and answered, "I have no age that your calendar can read," in an accent so soft it might have come from any county south of heaven. And the crowd laughed because slaves who speak in riddles are either touched by God or soon to be touched by the whip. Bidding began at 700 and ended at 1,002, an extravagant sum for a single male when women of childbearing years were going for 6, but Thaddeus raised his paddle with the mechanical calm of a man settling a debt he had long ago forgotten he owed, and afterward the other buyers looked away, as if they had witnessed not a purchase but a confession. On the ride back the boy rode in the last wagon, chains rattling against the boards each time a wheel dropped into a rut, and though the road was dusty he arrived with his skin somehow bright, as though the sun had chosen to polish him alone. The driver later swore that whenever he glanced back the boy was staring straight ahead, but the reflection in his eyes showed the road behind, the cypress trees bending one by one as if bowing to a funeral none of them had been invited to attend. At Bellevue he was marched to the quarter and given the name Elias, though the women who watched him pass felt the name settle on their tongues like a foreign coin, heavy and cold. That night they dreamed again of the man stepping from the river, but now his face bore a scar shaped like a fleur-de-lis just above the left eyebrow, and when they woke the scar was still there, printed on the inside of their eyelids so that every blink felt like a branding. For 3 weeks nothing happened that could be written in the overseer's daily log, unless one counted the way the mules began to shy from the boy whenever he passed the fence line, or the fact that the milk soured in the pails on the mornings he was sent to the dairy, clabbering in 2 ropes that smelled of iron and roses. He worked the hoe gang silently, his back straight, his rhythm so steady the rows he tended looked stitched by a seamstress too precise to tolerate a single puckered thread. Men who had labored beside him said that when the sun stood overhead his shadow pooled beneath his feet instead of stretching away, a dark puddle that never moved no matter how far they stepped to the left or right, and if you looked long enough you could see shapes swirling in it, mouths, hands, the silhouette of a woman reaching back over her shoulder as if to unhook a dress she could no longer bear to wear. On Sundays the slaves gathered under a live oak whose branches had been trained into the shape of a cathedral arch, and the preacher, himself owned by a neighboring estate, read from a Bible missing every page that mentioned Egypt, but Elias never joined the circle. Instead he walked the perimeter of the field, barefoot, the cuffs of his trousers rolled high enough to show the thin scars ringing his ankles like bracelets of pale hair. Once, a child, little Minnie, who had not yet grown into her front teeth, followed him at a distance, darting between the stalks of cane until she found herself at the edge of the bayou where the water moves slow as treacle and the alligators float like blackened logs. She said later that Elias stood on the bank and spoke to the river in a voice that sounded like water itself, and the river answered by bringing a garfish to the surface, its long snout crowded with needle teeth, which rolled belly up, and let him stroke it as gently as a mistress pets the cat that keeps her lap warm on winter evenings. The child told no one except her mother, who slapped her for lying and made her kneel on rice for an hour, but that night Minnie woke to find her palate soaked and smelling of bayou mud, and in the morning there were scales in her hair, tiny silver coins that flaked away when touched, leaving bald spots that never again grew properly. In June the missing began, though at first it seemed only that women walked off into the cane and forgot to come back, the way a person forgets a dream upon waking if the dream contains no terror sharp enough to snag the memory. The first was Clarissa, big with child, by the master's brother, a woman whose laugh could crack walnuts and who had once been caught teaching a piglet to dance on its hind legs for the reward of a crust of molasses bread. She went to gather muscadines at the edge of the woods and the basket was found upright, the grapes inside warm as if they had been breathed on, but Clarissa had become a space the air refused to fill. 3 days later it was Delphine, whose skin bore the intricate scars of her Ibo country, whorls, and crescents that told the story of her lineage more honestly than any written deed. She had been sent to hang wash on the lower line near the quarters, and the sheets were still snapping in the breeze when the other women returned, but Delphine was gone, leaving only a single braid coiled on the ground like a black snake that had decided to shed its owner instead of its skin. By the time the 4th woman disappeared, the shy girl called Ruth, who stuttered unless she sang, Thaddeus ordered the overseer to keep a nightly roll call, but the names slipped away faster than they could be spoken, as if the earth itself had grown a mouth somewhere beneath the rows and opened it each time a woman stepped too near the secret furrow where the cane roots twisted into shapes that resembled human vertebrae. The remaining women began to walk in pairs, then in threes, clutching each other's elbows so hard the bruises lasted weeks, but even this did not prevent the absences. One morning Lila the midwife woke to find the woman beside her, Esther, who snored like a man, replaced by a damp indentation smelling faintly of river reeds, and when Lila pressed her palm to the mat it was cold as iron in January, though the night had been thick enough to drown in. After the 7th disappearance, Thaddeus called the driver to the library and questioned him beneath the portrait of the first Wicker, whose eyes had been painted with such realism they appeared to follow any confession to its conclusion. The driver swore he had seen nothing, but when he left the room his shirt was dark between the shoulder blades, as if he had carried a weight so heavy it wept. The searches began at dawn. Men formed into lines an arm's length apart, beating the cane with sticks whose rhythm soon resembled a slow heart murmuring through the fields. They found nothing except small disturbances that might have been made by raccoons or wind, an overturned stone, a thread of indigo cloth caught on a thorn, the imprint of a heel so delicate it could have belonged to a child or to a woman walking on the edges of her feet because the ground itself had grown hot. Dogs were brought, hounds with voices like broken trumpets, but they ran in circles, noses to the earth, until one by one they began to whimper and crawl back to their handlers with their tails curled beneath their bellies like question marks nobody wanted answered. It was Elias who found the first clue, though he spoke of it only to the women, gathering them at the washing kettle while the overseer was drunk on peach brandy and the master closeted with ledgers that refused to balance however many times he added the column of crosses. Behind the quarter, where the privy trench cuts close to the bayou, the earth had sunk into a bowl no wider than a wagon wheel. At the bottom lay a single strand of hair, long enough to circle a woman's waist, braided through with threads of Spanish moss and tied at the end with a strip of cotton printed with tiny blue forget-me-nots, the same print that had lined the dress Ruth wore the day she vanished. When Elias lifted the braid it dripped water, though the soil around it was dry, and the droplet smelled of the river at low tide, that mixture of rot and lilac that clings to the skirts of women who wash their sins downstream. He buried it again, but that night every woman dreamed of a room beneath the ground, circular, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected not faces but the backs of heads. The napes of necks, the soft place where a braid begins its downward fall, and in the center of the room stood a chair of cypress wood, its arms carved with vines so lifelike they seemed to grow as they watched, and on the seat lay a single drop of honey that glowed like a tiny sun. July arrived with storms that camped on the horizon for days, flickering their lanterns of heat lightning but bringing no rain, so the cane leaves curled inward like hands preparing to receive a secret too heavy for words. The master began to pace the upper gallery at night, his boots striking the boards in a pattern that spelled out no word any living language could pronounce. And Eliza took to her bed with curtains drawn, though the heat lay on her chest like a sleeping dog that refused to wake. The preacher who came to baptize the new infant, born prematurely to a girl scarcely 14, refused to dip the child in the font, claiming the water hissed when it touched the baby's skin, though the mother later said the sound was only her own breath catching at the sight of Elias standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the child as if he recognized an old traveling companion. On the night of the full moon, when even the moths beat themselves to powder against the window panes rather than enter the house, Thaddeus summoned Elias to the library. Those who crept past the keyhole afterward spoke of a conversation conducted in tones so low they seemed to travel through the floorboards rather than the air, and of a moment when the master's voice cracked like a boy's, asking, "What do you want?" And of a silence that followed so complete the candle flames themselves paused mid-flicker, bending sideways as if listening. Elias emerged at dawn, his shirt unstained though the master's collar was spotted with what looked like rust, and when he descended the back stairs the women saw that the scar above his eyebrow had begun to bleed, a single line of red tracing the shape of the fleur-de-lis until it reached the corner of his mouth, where it vanished, as if he had drunk his own memory of pain. That day the cane was found flattened in a perfect circle 50 yards across, the stalks bent outward like the petals of a flower too obscene to name, and at the center lay a pile of women's shifts, folded with a precision none of them had ever mastered, the cloth still warm and smelling of milk let too near the fire. By August the big house had begun to smell of closed rooms in which flowers have been left to rot in their own vases, the wallpaper in the upper hall bubbled outward, the seams releasing a sticky sap that attracted flies bearing stripes the color of old bruises, and in the morning the servants found footprints of bare feet tracking the corridor, though every slave had been locked in the quarter under triple bolt. Eliza took to wandering the galleries at dusk wearing only her shift, her hair unbound and drifting behind her like smoke that has forgotten the fire. She spoke to no one, but once the cook saw her lean over the railing and extend her arm, palm up, as if offering something invisible to the air, and when she drew the hand back the skin was scored with tiny teeth marks that bled sluggishly, the shape of a mouth too delicate to belong to any human child. The overseer's wife, a woman who had borne 11 stillbirths and considered herself therefore immune to further horror, began to scream at supper one evening and could not stop. She said she had seen Elias standing beneath her window, his head tilted back, drinking the moonlight in gulps so greedy it dimmed overhead, and when she looked again his shadow had detached itself and was crawling up the side of the house, fingers finding crevices between the bricks with the patience of ivy that has decided to become a skeleton. They chained him that night to the whipping post, though he offered no resistance, and when the lash was brought down the leather split open like overripe fruit, spattering the ground with seeds that sprouted overnight into vines bearing trumpet-shaped flowers of a purple so deep it seemed to suck the light. By morning the post had been pulled from the earth, roots and all, and Elias was gone. The iron cuff still locked but empty, the inside polished to a shine that reflected the face of whoever looked into it, though the reflection always showed the viewer from behind, as if they had already turned away from themselves forever. After the escape the disappearances ceased, but the silence that replaced them was worse, a hush that settled over Bellevue like a sheet soaked in ice water and drawn up over the face of a fevered child. The women began to gather at night in the cabin where Lila kept her bundles of dried herbs, speaking in whispers of dreams in which they walked down a staircase spiraling beneath the bayou, each step carved from the vertebra of a woman whose name they almost remembered, until they reached a door of cypress wood banded with iron the color of old blood. Behind the door they could hear breathing, slow and patient, the sound of lungs that have learned to measure time by the movement of silt along the river bottom, and though none of them opened it they woke with water pooled in their cupped palms, tasting of honey and rust, and when they drank it they felt something settle inside them, a knowledge too heavy to carry and too dear to set down. Thaddeus took to riding the boundaries at dawn, a shotgun across his saddle though there was nothing to shoot, and once he followed the bayou so far west that he came upon the ruins of an indigo works abandoned since the Spanish days. Among the crumbling vats he found a woman's shoe, kid leather dyed the precise blue of Eliza's wedding gown, and inside the shoe lay a single tooth, incisor, small and sharp, with a filling of gold wire shaped like a forget-me-not. He buried the shoe beneath a cypress and said nothing, but that night he locked the library door and burned every ledger, the pages curling upward like black petals releasing numbers that had learned to crawl. In the morning the ashes were gone, the hearth swept clean, and on the desk lay a single strand of hair long enough to circle the entire room, braided through with threads of Spanish moss and tied at the end with a strip of cotton printed with tiny blue flowers. Eliza was found the next week floating face down in the cistern, her hair spread around her like ink spilled on parchment, and though her lungs were full of water her lips were dry, cracked, as if she had walked a great distance through a desert that existed only inside her, searching for a name she had forgotten how to pronounce. They buried her in the family plot beneath a stone carved with an angel whose face had been left deliberately blank, and on the night after the funeral the cistern cracked open, the water draining away into the earth so suddenly that the bricks sighed, a sound like a woman finally releasing a breath she had held since girlhood. Autumn came early, the cane harvested green and bitter because no one could bear to let it stand another month beneath a moon that seemed to swell each night until it pressed against the tree line like an eye too wide to blink. The workers cut in silence, the blades of their knives reflecting the sky in slices that tasted of metal when they accidentally licked their lips. One dawn, as the fog rose thick as cotton from the bayou, they found the final thing, a circle of ground within the stalks, pressed flat as if a house had once stood there and been lifted away entire, leaving only the imprint of its absence. At the center stood a chair of cypress wood, its arms carved with vines that moved if stared at too long, and on the seat lay a single drop of honey that glowed like a tiny sun. Around the chair, arranged like the spokes of a wheel, lay 7 braids of hair, each tied with a different scrap of cloth, indigo, calico, muslin, silk the color of old blood, leading away toward the 7 directions the wind can travel when it has decided to become a message nobody wants to receive. The overseer rode for the sheriff, but by the time they returned the fog had settled again, and when it lifted the chair was gone, only the braids remaining, rooted now like young trees, their ends vanished into soil so soft it accepted the fingers pressed into it as gratefully as a mouth accepts communion. They tried to dig, but the earth gave way to water a foot down, black and smelling of the river at low tide, and when they hauled up the first spadeful something surfaced briefly, a woman's hand, palm up, the lifeline split open like a seam that has decided to reveal what it once held, before the water closed over again and the braids tightened, straightened, becoming 7 paths that pointed away into the cane, each one disappearing into the green so smoothly that afterward no one could agree which direction any of them had taken. They say the house still stands, though Bellevue was sold the following year to a man from Nat Shea who grew rich shipping corpses north during the war and who hung the galleries with mirrors that reflect only the backs of those who look into them. They say that on nights when the river fog climbs the levee and presses its mouth against the windows, you can hear the floors breathing, slow and patient, the sound of lungs that have learned to measure time by the movement of silt. And sometimes, when the cane is left uncut too late in the season, travelers report seeing a shape moving between the rows, tall, narrow through the hips, skin the color of fresh maize, hair wet as though he has just stepped out of the river. He walks with his head tilted back, drinking the moonlight, and behind him the stalks bend outward one by one, forming a corridor that leads toward a chair no one has ever found again, though the ground within the circle remains bare, the soil soft as if a woman had just risen from her knees there, leaving behind a single drop of honey that glows like a tiny sun, and if you kneel and taste it you will find it still warm, still sweet, still carrying the faint green bite of copper that lingers on the tongue after a candle snuffer has been sucked for luck, and you will understand, though you will never be able to say, why the crosses in the margin of the ledger grow fainter each year, why the wallpaper in the upper hall continues to sweat glue, why the river answers when it is spoken to in a voice that sounds like water, and why every woman who passes Bellevue thereafter walks a little quicker, clutching at her own braid as if to remind herself that it still belongs to the head that grew it, while somewhere beneath the earth a door of cypress wood banded with iron waits for the footfall that will finally recognize the staircase carved from the bones of women whose names are being erased one by one, the way a tongue rubs away the last taste of honey until only the memory of sweetness remains, and even that begins to taste of rust. They say the ledger resurfaced only once more, in the winter of 1871, when a Thames dredger hooked a waterlogged satchel off the Pimlico foreshore and found inside a calf-bound book swollen to twice its thickness, pages fused like lungs in pleurisy. The dredger, a silent man named Josiah Creech who had lost his tongue to a Russian bayonet at Inkerman, carried the satchel to the nearest public house and laid it on the counter like an offering. The landlord, a student of odds and ends, peeled apart the first leaf with a penknife and read, in a clerk's slanted hand, the entry for Eliza Frost, age 30, height 5'2", weight 8 stone 4, organs removed in order of cooling, heat retained in smallest jar, balance carried forward. Beneath the ink, as though the river itself had tried to annotate the account, ran a tide line of reddish salt that glittered when the gas jet struck it. Creech would not touch the book again. He left it on the bar and walked out into the sleet, and that night hanged himself from a derrick at Millbank with a length of tarred rope, his body still warm when the tide police cut him down, so warm that the surgeon who examined him wrote in his report that the blood seemed to simmer about the heart. The ledger disappeared before the coroner's inquest, spirited away by a clerk who claimed the Admiralty had prior right to anything dredged from the river, and nothing more was heard of it save a rumor that the Admiralty librarian, a Jesuitical man named Father Hinsley, locked himself for 3 nights running in the map room, emerging at last with his hair turned the color of wood ash and his eyes red as if from weeping smoke. Yet the balance, once struck, travels like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. It moves through copper wire, through iron pipe, through the thin arterial tubes that carry gaslight into every cellar of the expanding city. In 1879 the Southwark and Vauxhall Water Company laid a new main along the street where the institution had stood, and workmen driving pickaxes into the clay struck a layer of brick so hot it scalded their boots through the soles. When they broke through they found a void no bigger than a chimney flue, lined with the imprint of ribs, and at its base a glass vial sealed with black wax, inside which a bead of fluid rolled back and forth as though alive. The foreman, a Methodist, pocketed the phial intending to smash it in private, but on the ride home he felt the warmth travel up his arm and lodge beneath his collarbone, and that night he dreamed of a woman whose breast opened like a cupboard door to reveal shelves of glowing jars. He woke unable to speak below a whisper, and within a fortnight had taken voluntary retirement to the Kent coast, where he kept the phial buried under a rosebush that bloomed crimson even in December, its petals so hot they scorched the fingers of any child who tried to pick them. The mains water, once connected, carried more than hydrogen and oxygen, Householders along the route complained that their tea tasted of iron and orange peel, and that when they poured it into saucers for their cats the liquid steamed long after it should have cooled. A widow in Kennington, filling her bath one winter evening, felt the water grow suddenly warm against her ankles, then hot, until she had to step back or be scalded. She pulled the plug, but the tank above the stove continued to fill, the copper pipes glowing dull red, and when the ceiling gave way it released not water but a torrent of rose petals, brown and fragrant, that settled on the linoleum in the exact silhouette of a woman's torso, arms outstretched, ribs flayed open like wings. The insurance company paid for the damage and suppressed the report, yet the widow, afterwards, could not bear to be in a room with a kettle. She took to drinking cold well water drawn before dawn, and even then she tasted citrus and felt the ghost of heat pooling under her own ribs, as though somewhere a ledger had been reopened and her name entered in red ink. Medicine, in its relentless march, had by 1885 begun to speak of metabolism, of calories and thermodynamics, of the body as a furnace that might be stoked or banked. Lecturers at the new medical college in South Kensington warned students against the mysticism of innate heat, yet in the same breath they repeated experiments conducted with copper calorimeters, measuring the warmth emitted by dying dogs, by consumptives, by the severed limbs of accident victims. A young demonstrator named Dr. Lionel Ashe, curious and ungovernable, constructed a cabinet lined with thermopiles, intending to capture the last spark of vitality and convert it to electricity sufficient to ring a bell. He obtained, from where he never said, the heart of a stillborn infant, and placed it within the cabinet connected by silver wires to a galvanometer. At the moment the organ ceased its fibrillary twitching, the needle swung wildly, the bell rang once, and a bead of mercury within the dial shattered into droplets that ran uphill and vanished through a crack in the mahogany. Ashe, elated, repeated the experiment with the kidney of a drowned sailor, then with the brain of a hanged murderer, each time recording a pulse of heat that defied explanation. Only when he attempted to use a fragment of muscle taken from his own thigh, an operation performed under cocaine in his rooms after midnight, did the cabinet grow suddenly cold, frost forming on the copper lining, the bell silent. He woke to find the wound stitched with thread he did not remember threading, and in the galvanometer a single drop of fluid that burned to the touch, glowing like the file the waterman had buried under the rosebush. Ashe published nothing. He resigned his post and sailed for Calcutta, but at port said he disappeared from the ship, leaving in his cabin a notebook whose final page bore the calculation: heat owed to Eliza Frost, 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit x 58 years x 365 days equals balance outstanding. The century turned, electric light replaced gas, motorcabs replaced hansoms, and the embankment was extended eastward, burying the old foreshore beneath granite and cement. Yet the warmth persists, a subterranean pulse that can be felt on certain nights when the fog is thickest, rising through the iron grates that ventilate the underground. Ticket collectors at Waterloo speak of a draught that smells of orange and iron, that causes the electric bulbs to dim and the turnstiles to click open of their own accord. Engineers sent to investigate find nothing but a faint scorch mark on the concrete, shaped like a woman with her arms flung wide, ribs cracked open like a pair of doors. They scrub it away, yet it returns, darker each time, until at last they cover it with a steel plate bolted into the bedrock, and even then, on the anniversary of Eliza Frost's disappearance, the metal grows too hot to touch and the bolts expand and shear with a sound like a sigh. In 1911 a committee was formed to electrify the tram lines along St. George's Road, and workmen sinking pylons unearthed a cache of glass jars, 12 in number, each sealed with black wax, each labelled in the same clerkly hand. They were taken to the borough coroner's office, but before the clerk could catalogue them the jars began to sweat, moisture beading on the glass like tears, and then to crack, one after another, releasing a warmth that set the linoleum afire. The coroner, a prudent man, ordered the remains thrown into the furnace of the adjacent power station, and for a week the turbines ran at a speed beyond their design, the dynamos glowing red, until a bearing seized and the night sky over Southwark lit up with a sheet of white flame that could be seen from Highgate Hill. In the morning the engineers found the furnace cold, its grates empty, but the brickwork bore the imprint of ribs, perfect, delicate, as though pressed there while the clay was soft. The First World War scattered the city's sons across continents of mud and wire, and for 4 years the pulse beneath the pavement faltered, starved of the daily increment of heat that war had diverted to France, to Mesopotamia, to Gallipoli. Yet even in the trenches the balance persisted. Field hospitals reported cases of men who, though shot through the heart, remained warm for hours, their blood refusing to cool, until orderlies noticed a faint odor of citrus rising from the wound. One nurse, a VAD from Camberwell, wrote in her diary of a corporal who died at dawn, his last breath so hot it scalded her cheek, she tasted orange and felt, for an instant, a heartbeat that was not his own. After the armistice she returned to London and took lodgings in a house near the old institution site. She never married, and on winter nights she could be seen walking the embankment, her gloved hands pressed to her ribs as though comforting something caged within. Between the wars the city grew taller, deeper, louder, yet the warmth, like a memory that refuses to fade, found new arteries. In 1927 the London Electric Supply Corporation sank a transformer vault beneath the junction where the institution had once stood, and workmen threading cables through the concrete encountered a cavity no blueprint showed, a void shaped like a woman supine, arms extended, ribs flared. The engineers poured in liquid slag, intending to seal it forever, but the slag cooled only on the surface. Core samples taken years later revealed a heart-shaped bubble of glass at the center, within which a droplet of mercury trembled, perpetually molten. The transformer failed repeatedly, fuses blowing for no measurable load, until at last the vault was abandoned, the cables rerouted, and the hatch welded shut. Yet the night watchman, making his rounds, still hears beneath the manhole cover a sound like the slow turning of a page, and feels, rising through the soles of his boots, a warmth that makes him think, though he will not speak of it, of his mother's kitchen before the war, of oranges spitted and roasting on the stove, of a woman's voice singing in another room. The Second World War brought fire from the sky, incendiaries rained upon Southwark, and the night of the 10th of May, 1941 the Thames itself burned, oil and alcohol and sugar from the docks turning the river into a conduit of flame. Firemen dragging hoses along the embankment spoke of a heat that seemed to rise from below, as though the earth had joined the conflagration, and one, a veteran of the Blitz, claimed to have seen a woman walking barefoot across the molten asphalt, her shift ablaze yet unconsumed, her chest open to reveal a furnace that cast no shadow. He tried to follow, but the street collapsed into the sewers, and when the rescue parties dug through the rubble they found no trace of her, only a glass vial sealed with black wax, intact amid the slag. It was passed from hand to hand, lost finally in the chaos of reconstruction, but those who touched it retained for days the smell of orange and iron, and dreamed of ledgers whose columns added not numbers but years, not pounds but degrees. Peace returned, and with it the cold rationality of peacetime. The city rebuilt itself in concrete and steel, the past buried deeper than any coffin. Yet the warmth persists, a subterranean ledger that never forgets. In 1952 the great smog descended, and undertakers worked day and night, yet some bodies, removed from rooms where gas fire had failed, remained warm for hours, the skin flushed as if with pleasure, the lips parted in a smile that horrified the mourners. A pathologist at Guy's, curious, inserted a thermometer into the liver of a charwoman found dead in Blackfriars and recorded a temperature that rose even as he watched, climbing past 100 degrees, past 105 degrees, until the mercury burst from the tube and vanished in a wisp of steam. He wrote a paper, tentatively suggesting a new form of postmortem hypothermia, but the journal refused it, and within the year he resigned his post and emigrated to Canada, where he was later found frozen to death in a barn, the thermometer beside him shattered, the mercury pooled in the shape of a human heart. Tonight, if you walk along the embankment where the new lamps cast a white light that leaves no shadow, you may feel it still, a breath of warmth on a night that has no right to be warm, a scent of citrus and iron where no orange cellar stands. The traffic roars, the trains rattle beneath your feet, yet for an instant the city grows quiet, as though listening for a heartbeat that is not its own. Look up at the windows of the office blocks, and you may see, in a pane that catches the reflection of the river, the outline of a woman with her arms flung wide, ribs cracked open like a pair of doors, the space within not dark but glowing with the steady fire of a ledger that balances its accounts in degrees of pain. You will hurry on, telling yourself it is only the light, only the fog, only the city's fevered dream of itself. But the warmth remains, lodged beneath your own ribs, a small, persistent coal that travels with you, that will not cool, that waits for the day when the account is closed and the fire, at last, comes home. They never found the second ledger, the one that was said to record the credits rather than the debts, though men have died searching for it in archives as far apart as Edinburgh and New Orleans. The story goes, it is only a story, whispered in the stacks of the London Library where the air tastes of mildew and candle skillets, that in 1958 a junior clerk cataloguing the papers of a defunct marine insurance firm discovered a folio wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with the same black wax. The cloth bore the faint impress of ribs, as though the book had been pressed against a woman's breast until the cloth took her shape. The clerk, whose name is variously given as Morrison or Morton, carried the folio to the reading room, slit the wax with a paper knife, and opened it beneath the green-shaded lamp. Those who were present say the temperature dropped so sharply that their breath fogged, then rose again with the suddenness of a fever breaking. The clerk himself was seen to lean closer, as though the page exhaled a scent he recognized from childhood, orange and iron and something like a mother's hair warmed by the fire. He read for perhaps 10 minutes, turning the leaves with the reverence of a priest, and then he closed the book, tied the tape, and walked out into the dusk without returning the folio to the desk. He was never employed again. Some say he boarded a ship for Valparaiso, others that he entered the cloister of an Anglican order in Norfolk and died there of a cancer that began in the tongue and spread until he could no longer swallow holy water without feeling it boil. What he read, or what read him, survives only in fragments quoted by those who glimpsed the open page over his shoulder. The handwriting was the same as in the 1798 ledger, spidery, slanted, economical, but the columns were reversed. Instead of organs subtracted, years were added. Instead of heat lost, warmth restored. Beside each entry stood a name and a date of death, but the dates lay in the future, 1963, 1971, 1987, written in an ink that shimmered like mercury when the lamp swayed. One line, recalled by a retired actuary who sat opposite, read, "To Eliza Frost, repayment in full, 1 lifetime, male, 73 years, heart removed painlessly, balance closed." The actuary, a man who had spent his life reducing catastrophe to decimal points, felt the figures slide together in his mind like beads on an abacus, and that night he woke unable to feel his own pulse. He lived another 14 years, but his wrist remained cold, the artery silent, though the chest beneath thrummed with a warmth that made nurses step back from the bedside as though from an unbanked stove. When he died, on the exact date entered beside his own name in the missing folio, the undertaker found the body too hot to wash, and the death certificate recorded the cause simply as cardiac absence, a phrase that satisfied no coroner but was allowed to stand because no one wished to pursue the matter further. The folio itself vanished with the clerk, yet copies, always partial, always denied, began to surface in the months that followed. A surgeon in Liverpool received by post a single sheet listing the names of 3 dock workers who had collapsed of spontaneous hypothermia within hours of one another. The paper was warm when unsealed, and the ink, though still wet, would not smear. A midwife in Stepney found tucked into her bag after a difficult delivery a page torn from a larger book, on which had been written the time of the infant's birth and, beside it, the hour of the mother's death 23 years later. The figures tallied to the minute, and the warmth of the paper lingered long enough to scorch the lining of her pocket. Each fragment carried the same odor, citrus, iron, the faint sweetness of burnt hair, and those who handled them found, within days, that their own blood ran hotter, that wounds healed without scabs, that they could not endure the touch of snow without a sensation of boiling water under the skin. They learned to fear the approach of their own death dates, recorded in a hand not their own, and some, so it is said, tried to escape by submitting to surgery, begging surgeons to excise the heart preemptively, to replace it with rubber and steel, anything that would break the contract. But the heat followed the incision, pooling in the cavity like water finding its level, and the operations ended invariably in hemorrhage that no ligature could control, the blood steaming as it struck the theatre floor, the final entry written in vapor that condensed on the ceiling in the shape of ribs. By 1963 the fragments had coalesced into a rumor that passed for fact among certain circles, that the ledger was not a book at all but a process, a current that flowed through the city's arteries of copper and iron, accruing interest in human degrees. Engineers working on the Victoria Line spoke of tunnels that grew warm though no train had passed, of sections where the cast iron segments rang like bells when struck, emitting a note that made the navvies think, though they dared not say, of women singing lullabies in rooms that had long since been demolished. A surveyor, lowering a plumb bob into a shaft near Vauxhall, felt the line go slack, then taut again, as though something had breathed on it. When he hauled it up, the lead weight glowed dull red, and the hemp smelled of orange zest. The men refused to work that shift, and the tunnel was rerouted, though the old bore remains, sealed behind a bulkhead of steel plates riveted with bolts that still weep rust the color of dried blood. On the night the first test train ran, the driver glanced back into the rear carriage and saw, reflected in the glass partition, the outline of a woman in a shift, her arms extended along the poles as though crucified upon the air, the cavity beneath her ribs pulsing with the same cadence as the traction motors. He completed the journey, but he never drove again. He spends his days in a bungalow near Southend, sitting in a bath of cold water that must be replenished every hour, and when visitors ask why he cannot bear to be warm, he answers only that he has seen the books balanced, and that the interest is compounded daily. The repayment, once begun, is relentless. In 1971, a fire observer stationed on the roof of the National Gallery during a bomb scare felt the parapet grow warm beneath his palms. When he looked down, he saw the stone had taken the impression of ribs so fine he could count them, 24 in all, the 12th pair flaring like wings. He radioed for relief, but before it arrived he smelled citrus and felt his own heart stumble, as though a page had been turned too quickly. They found him collapsed beside the telescope, the stopwatch still running in his hand, its hands frozen at the exact minute entered beside his name in a ledger no one admitted to keeping. The autopsy revealed the heart intact but cold, the blood within it steaming, as though the organ had been transplanted from a body still alive. The death was recorded as coronary thrombosis, the rib impression erased by sandblasting, yet on quiet nights the custodians hear the stone sigh, a sound like pages riffled by a warm breeze, and they find scorch marks in the shape of a woman's open torso, there and gone before the security cameras can focus. By 1987 the account had grown vast, its entries scattered across continents, yet London remained the clearinghouse where the balances were struck. A nurse at St. Thomas, tallying the temperatures of patients in the intensive care unit, noticed that on one April night every monitor registered 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit precisely, neither rising nor falling, though some lay in induced hypothermia, others in fevered sepsis. She mentioned it to the registrar, who shrugged, machines malfunction, but she could not shake the sense that the ward itself breathed in unison, that the heat was being gathered, counted, transferred. She began to dream of a theatre lit by a single candle, of a woman on a platform, her chest a window box of dried roses, of a clerk who dipped his pen into a vein and wrote her own name beside a date she could not read. On the morning of her 30th birthday, April 14th, the anniversary of Eliza Frost's disappearance, she woke to find her uniform scorched across the breast, the fabric parted as though by a retractor, and beneath it the skin unbroken but imprinted with the faint brown outline of ribs. She resigned before the day was out, moved to the Orkneys, and lives now in a croft where the wind never stills, sleeping in a shed open to the sky, because only the Atlantic cold can keep the warmth from gathering under her own heart. The process, once named, acquires the inevitability of natural law. Physicists at Imperial College, measuring microcaloric fluctuations in the city's ambient temperature, have recorded anomalies that cluster along the trace of the old Surrey institution, spikes of heat that rise and vanish within seconds, leaving no source, no residue, only a scent that the technicians describe, reluctantly, as reminiscent of orange groves under iron rain. They publish papers attributing the phenomenon to frictional sparks from braking trains, to the exhalations of crowds, to the entropy of a million lives compressed into a few square miles, yet in the small hours, when the laboratories are empty, the oscilloscope traces a waveform shaped like a ribcage, expanding and contracting in perfect silence. The senior researcher, a man who has never heard of Eliza Frost, keeps a fan running continuously on his desk. He claims the air grows warm whenever he thinks of his mother, who died in a ward warmed by steam pipes that throbbed like hearts, and he has begun to dream of ledgers whose columns balance not in jowls but in years, not in watts but in wounds. Tonight, beneath the city, the account continues. Every death by fever, every unexplained warmth, every heart that ceases yet refuses to cool, is entered in a book no hand now living acknowledges. The entries are written in heat alone, legible only to the skin, and they accumulate with the patience of compound interest. When you step onto the underground platform and feel the wind that precedes the train, warm though the tunnels are deep, you are feeling the draft of pages turning far below, the displacement of air as another name is inscribed. The woman beside you, loosening her coat, may be paying a debt she does not know she owes. The child clutching a paper bag of orange peel may be accruing interest on a life not yet lived. There is no escape, no bankruptcy, no statute of limitations. The ledger remembers what the city forgets, and the balance must be restored down to the last decimal of a degree. And yet the final entry remains unwritten, the last page blank, waiting for the hand that will close the account. Some say it will require a death of absolute cold, a body from which every trace of warmth has been withdrawn, a heart transplanted into ice so pure that no memory of blood remains. Others insist that the debt can be repaid only by fire, by a conflagration so complete that the city itself becomes a crucible, its bricks liquefying into glass that retains the imprint of every rib, every artery, every breath that ever steamed upon the Thames. Between these futures the ledger hovers, a book without covers, its leaves the very air we breathe, its ink the heat we shed with every heartbeat. Walk now to the river at low tide, where the exposed foreshore glitters with fragments of glass blackened by coal fires, by bombs, by centuries of refuse. Pick up a shard and hold it to the lamp. You may see, caught within the curve, the reflection of a woman in a shift, her arms extended, her chest open to reveal not darkness but a steady glow. The shard will warm in your palm, and if you listen, truly listen, you will hear the faint turning of a page, the scratch of a pen dipped in living blood, writing your name beside a date you have not yet reached. Drop the shard, walk away, rub your hands together to dispel the warmth, it will not leave. It travels inward, lodging beneath the sternum, a small persistent coal that beats with the rhythm of a ledger that never forgets. And when, years from now, you wake in a room that has grown inexplicably warm, when you taste orange and iron on a night when neither fruit nor metal has touched your lips, when your own heart stumbles as though a page has been turned too quickly, then you will know the account is nearly balanced, that the final entry approaches. You may try to flee to colder climates, to rooms without stoves, to beds without blankets, but the warmth will follow, percolating through floorboards, through railway sleepers, through the copper wires that carry your voice to distant ears. It is the interest accrued on a debt contracted long before your birth, in a theatre where a woman lay with her chest cracked open like a cupboard, her organs replaced by the dried petals of summer, a candle guttering where her heart should have been. There is no ending, only the slow, inexorable approach of the last figure in the last column. The city will forget you, as it has forgotten her, the bricks will crumble, the rails will rust, the river will silt up until no ship can pass. But the ledger will remain, written in the very motion of molecules, in the shiver of atoms that cannot cease their dance. And when the final page turns, when the last degree is surrendered, the last heartbeat balanced against the last breath, the warmth will gather, rising through the clay, through the gravel, through the bones of the city, until the entire island glows like a coal suspended in the dark, a single ember that contains every name, every year, every wound. Stand now at the center of the bridge, the river flowing black beneath you, the lamps flickering as the current that feeds them hesitates. Feel the pavement warm against your soles, the heat traveling upward through the bones of your legs, pooling beneath the ribs. Listen, the traffic fades, the wind stills, and in the hush you will hear it, the soft, deliberate turning of a page that is not paper but flesh, the scratch of a pen that writes in temperature rather than time. The scent rises, citrus, iron, the faint sweetness of a room where oranges once roasted on a coal that never cooled. You cannot move, the warmth holds you gently, as a clerk holds a pen, as a surgeon holds a scalpel poised above the breast. The ledger is almost balanced, the entry is nearly written. And when, at last, you feel the final degree slip from your chest like a sigh, you will understand that the account was never Eliza Frost's alone, but the city's, the centuries, your own. The last image is this, a shard of glass on a tide-washed foreshore, catching the reflection of a woman whose chest is a lantern, whose ribs are the bars of a cage within which a single ember revolves, slow as a moth, bright as a star. The shard warms, the tide turns, the river covers it inch by inch, yet the glow persists, visible through the black water like a heartbeat suspended. Somewhere overhead, trains cross the bridge, their lights tracing arcs that vanish as soon as they appear. No one sees the ember, no one remembers the name. But the warmth remains, traveling outward, upward, inward, until the entire city breathes in unison, a single organism accounting for its heat, balancing its bones against the indefinite night. And the page, once turned, cannot be unturned, the entry, once written, cannot be erased. The ledger is the city, and the city is the ledger, and the final figure, when it comes, will be written not in ink but in the very last warmth you have to give, a signature scrawled in temperature alone, fading only when the river itself grows cold, when the ember, at last, goes out.